Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 10 trade targets for the 2025 fantasy football season, because over the course of the last couple of weeks, whether it be via the live stream, the comment section, via Patreon, many of you have asked me, Andrew, who should I be trading for the weeks ahead? And I wanted to go ahead and talk about all four primary positions, trade targets at running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback throughout three different spectrums of time based on the rest of season strength of schedule. Now, as you can see to the right side of the screen, I have the 2025 running back strength of schedule for the remainder of the season, weeks 10 through 17. But I also want to go into even further detail for those of you who are still in the hunt for a fantasy playoff position from weeks 10 through 14, or for those of you who have already established yourself with a great win-loss record and you're already on your way to the fantasy playoffs and want to prepare for that. So we'll talk about all four positions and three different spectrums of time and the rest of season strength of schedule that is going to give us the confidence to trade for these players so they can help us capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. Now, as you guys can see to the right side of the screen, the New England Patriots, based on the remainder of the season, have the easiest strength of schedule for the running back position. But that's primarily because of the statistics that I've gathered being from weeks 5 through 9. I've isolated the last 4 to 5 games from each individual defense and how many rushing statistics they've allowed to opposing running backs, because the last 4 to 5 games truly represent these defenses and their efforts, and of course the injuries that have taken place over the course of the season thus far. So before I get into talking about the running back conversation at further detail, because this is going to be quite the long-winded episode, a quick reminder for those of you guys who are trying to travel on over to a different section of the video, perhaps you don't need to go ahead and trade for a running back, but are looking for a quarterback, a wide receiver, or a tight end. There are timestamps down in the description of the video. You can travel down there and check out those different sections to which you can go ahead and find the information you need. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel, because I'm making daily fantasy football content in order to help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. And by subscribing today, not only do you gain an edge upon your league mates for the remainder of the year, but of course you help me get one step closer to achieving my goal of 100,000 subscribers. We're very close. I cannot thank you guys enough for all the support. Also, a quick reminder, at the end of today's episode, I will be putting together a couple plays via Betr like I do every single Friday. So for those of you who are interested in potentially putting in your own plays, and of course getting my Sunday morning rankings every single week for the remainder of the season, when you sign up today using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of 10, and then make that first time play within a real cash play, you'll be eligible to get those rankings at all positions, including flex, half PPR, and full PPR, sent from my email directly to yours every single Sunday. So take advantage of the opportunity by signing up today using code Andrew. Get the free $10 via Betr, and make sure you're eligible based on the map to the right side of the screen. Of course, putting together plays at the end of the episode. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go ahead and let's talk about the running back position in regards to weeks 10 through 17. Again, for the remainder of the season, we find, based on rushing statistics isolated, being rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, specifically because of the fact that receiving statistics are often due to the running back skill level within the receiving game, the quarterback's tendency to check it down, and additionally game scripts that may provide more or less receiving upside. Therefore, we isolate rushing statistics to find that the Patriots, Dolphins, Saints, Steelers, Texans, etc. have the easiest schedule going forward at the running back position, while the Colts, Titans, Giants are at the opposite end of the spectrum, in which, yes, we may be a little bit worried about Jonathan Taylor, but when you have a talent at that capacity, that offensive line is humming, I'm not too worried about his overall situation. We're in fact just specifically isolating this conversation to take advantage of more advantageous positions rather than worry about our studs being in a difficult matchup. Now, with this information, we could very easily come to a conclusion as to which running backs are the best potential targets going for the future, but a couple of questions need to be asked before we get into the conversation of who are we targeting. First and foremost, we have to talk about, are you in the playoff hunt? Are you still trying to win out for the remainder of the season? Does your team need to win now? And does an upcoming bye week for a running back throw your entire season off and could potentially lose you the year? If that's a possibility, then we have to establish that and, of course, navigate with the upcoming potential of not going after players that have an upcoming bye. But if you're in a position where you've already gotten yourself 6 wins, 3 losses, 7 wins, 8 wins, 9 wins, and you're preparing for the fantasy playoffs, then if bye weeks aren't going to bother you, then we'll go ahead and we'll talk about the fantasy playoff stretch of weeks 15 through 17. But just looking off of these statistics, objectively speaking, Achane of the Miami Dolphins, looking at the upcoming schedule of Buffalo, Washington, a bye week, if you can afford it, the New Orleans Saints, Jets, Pittsburgh Steelers, Cincinnati Bengals, and Buccaneers. 4 of his next 6 games being top 12 running back matchups. And this is a pattern you're going to see for the Miami Dolphins. All of their threats, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback, all have incredible schedules ahead. So buying in on Achane could be very much so promising for the remainder of the year. We have a guy like Jaylen Warren, who I've talked about ad nauseum for the course of the last couple weeks. 4 of his next 6 games being all top 6 running back matchups against Los Angeles, Cincinnati. I mean, we're talking about Buffalo, Baltimore, Miami. Those are, again, incredible matchups ahead in which he can take advantage of as we go forward. Then we have guys like Saquon Barkley, who, yes, it's very difficult to trade for a player of this caliber, but 4 of his last 6 games of the season are all top 10 matchups at the position, which could easily win you a fantasy football championship, which, again, if you're preparing for the playoffs, you may look in that direction. So let's go ahead and let's focus on the time spectrum of weeks 10 through 14. For those of you who are needing to win out and cannot afford to have a potential bye week on your hands as you are in the playoff hunt and trying to put yourself in a position to make the playoffs as one of the final seeds. Of course, the upcoming schedule ahead with upcoming buys pretty much eliminates the potential of trading for guys like, Achane, because the New England Patriots, the Miami Dolphins, the New Orleans Saints, the Chargers, the Broncos all have bye weeks ahead. So if we're not going to look in the direction of those options because of those bye weeks, considering we need to win out for the remainder of the year, of course, that would leave us with available options such as Jaylen Warren, James Cook, potentially Quinshon Judkins, Travis Etienne, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, Derrick Henry, and Kenneth Walker. Again, the most affordable of the group of players I just mentioned are probably going to be Travis Etienne and the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 7th easiest strength of schedule throughout the span of time with 0 bye weeks. And the defenses that they're playing against are allowing 14.75 fantasy points per game on average throughout this spectrum of time. The Seattle Seahawks, of course, with Kenneth Walker there. Kenneth Walker most recently in this most recent game getting red zone utilization, which certainly could elevate him to the conversation of getting those touchdowns and becoming a top 15 prospect for the rest of the way, especially with his upcoming schedule ahead, 11th in terms of overall ranking. And then we have David Montgomery, who, yes, he's going to be playing behind Jahmyr Gibbs, but certainly has the potential of scoring touchdowns every single week out. And considering their schedule ahead is the 8th best, there's a possibility with no bye week ahead for him to go ahead and find himself in a semblance of success in which very easily could elevate him to the next level of this conversation, to which those 3 prospects are affordable and potentially should be traded for. Then we have an opportunity of looking at some of the more disadvantageous schedules in regards to the running back position throughout the spectrum of time. I am trying to avoid having Aaron Jones, Tyron Tracy, or Trey Benson on my roster, because even though this is only isolated in rushing statistics, unless Aaron Jones, Trey Benson, and Tracy are going to carry their overall workloads of opportunity from the receiving category alone, the rushing opportunity against these defenses is incredibly difficult, and I'm not too interested in kind of rostering these players, much less hoping that they can help me capture a championship throughout this spectrum of time to get me to the playoffs. Now, when we go ahead and continue on, speaking of capturing a championship, from weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy playoffs, please do not play a championship in week 18 because half the players are going to be out with injury and or preparing for the actual NFL playoffs. We have guys like Saquon Barkley, like who I mentioned earlier, 4 of his final 6 games are top 10 running back matchups. We have a guy like Bucky Irving that if you're in a position to where you are preparing for the fantasy playoffs, you could take advantage of the fact that he is once again going to miss this week. And if a player in your league has him on roster and is struggling and cannot afford to have him miss, I would trade for Bucky Irving because his upcoming schedule ahead, again, is advantageous, taking on Atlanta, Carolina, and Miami, which, I mean, honestly, by the time we get to weeks 15 through 17, he should be at a full healthy capacity considering how long they have held him out. Now, if you're looking to take a potential risk on a buy low prospect, you could look in the direction of Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. You could look in the direction of Woody Marks, who has technically the number 1 matchup. You could look in the direction of Travion Henderson, 3 rookie running backs who could take over the job late in the year and absolutely go nuclear because of the upcoming schedules ahead in which they are exposed to. That's a certain possibility. But in regards to the overall matchups ahead, I mean, we're talking about potentially trading for studs like Barkley or Bucky, or looking towards potential buy low prospects. I mean, shoot, technically even the Saints have an easy strength of schedule with Carolina, the New York Jets, and Tennessee. But can I trust Alvin Kamara when I get there? Maybe if you want to hold him on your bench, you can, but even then, I'm not too interested in trading for him. I mean, shoot, maybe he got dropped in your league in which you could pick him up and just stash him there until further notice. Now, talking about some of the more disadvantageous schedules, even though Taylor, Gibbs, Cook, and Jacobs are at the bottom of this conversation, the talent level at which they exude on a weekly basis purely is going to put them into positions to succeed. So I'm not worried about them. I'm not freaking out. I'm just purely going after advantageous positions as we go forward. Now, if we continue on, we'll discover the wide receiver strength of schedule from weeks 10 through 17, where we find that the Giants, Vikings, Packers, Bears, Eagles, Lions, etc. have the easiest strength of schedule, while on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Chiefs, Jaguars, Raiders, Buccaneers, and Saints with the most difficult strength of schedule ahead. But in terms of fantasy points per game allowed to these wide receivers based on receiving statistics isolated, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format, we find that the separation between the number 1 and the number 12 team is not a great distance. But once you talk about number 1 to number 32, we're talking about 7 to 8 fantasy points of separation of potential value that could be acted upon. So when we're looking in the direction of which wide receivers that we could theoretically go after, objectively speaking, we can look at the top of this list and say, oh yeah, these are players that we want to go after, but you have to answer the same questions that we asked earlier. Are you in a position to where you are in the playoff hunt? Are you in a win now situation where you have to win the next 5 consecutive games? Can you afford to take on a player that has a bye week, or are you preparing for the fantasy playoffs? Once all those are answered, you could look in the direction of someone like Wan'Dale Robinson. Though he does have an upcoming bye week, 5 of the next 7 games in which he plays are top 10 wide receiver matchups, and Darius Slayton could also benefit from this. Then we have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, in which 6 of their next 8 games are top 11 wide receiver matchups. And then we have teams like the Cincinnati Bengals and Dallas Cowboys sitting at the number 11 and 12 positions. The Bengals and Cowboys are currently both top 12, and of course, on bye week. So if there's someone in your league that cannot afford for them to be on bye, for those of you who are in a position where you know you're going to make the playoffs, take advantage of their misfortune and trade for players like Lamb and Chase, or Pickens, or someone like T. Higgins that, yes, is coming off of a nuclear performance, but take advantage of the fact that they might have an opportunity to give them away because they cannot afford to lose the upcoming week. These are possibilities in which you can go after, but let's go ahead and let's talk about spectrums of time, specifically weeks 10 through 14 for the wide receiver position. For those of you who are looking to win out and obviously have to avoid upcoming bye weeks that may in fact hurt you, of course, the New York Giants, the Los Angeles Chargers, and Cincinnati Bengals at the top of this conversation, all dealing with bye weeks. So you might want to be careful with that overall situation, but the Cincinnati Bengals having that bye week this week in specific. But what that leaves us up to is the Vikings, Packers, Cardinals, Bears, Eagles, Rams, Baltimore Ravens, and Detroit Lions, and the receivers that are notably, of course, associated with those offenses. But the most affordable options within trade targets throughout that entire conversation of those 8 teams I just mentioned revolve around Jordan Addison, who, again, in this most recent week, not the greatest overall performance, but since coming back from his suspension has been incredible. And once he builds that rapport with J.J. McCarthy, the upcoming schedule ahead throughout this spectrum of time, Baltimore, Chicago, Green Bay, Seattle, Washington, incredible across the board. Then we have the Chicago Bears and Rome Odunze. Again, Rome Odunze coming off of a goose egg of a week. In the event in which you have an opportunity to trade for him at a buy low capacity, why not do so now prior to their upcoming schedule ahead against the Giants, the Vikings, the Steelers, the Eagles, and the Green Bay Packers, either games in which they're going to have advantageous positions against following secondaries or potential shootouts in negative game scripts. Then we have the Baltimore Ravens and Zay Flowers. Now that you have Lamar Jackson back, we are in a position in which Zay Flowers could find a lot of success. And very similar to Wan'Dale Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, who has a very advantageous schedule from weeks 10 through 17, he's a wide receiver that is very much so reliant on receptions. And Wan'Dale Robinson and Zay Flowers would both be full PPR targets within the upcoming weeks. And then we have someone like Jameson Williams, who, yes, did score a touchdown in this most recent game, but he could be the most affordable / actionable play in which you can go after and get some association with that Detroit Lions offense that does have themselves no bye weeks ahead, and very much so potential shootouts against the Washington Commanders, Philadelphia Eagles, New York Giants, Green Bay Packers, and Dallas Cowboys in this overall spectrum of time. Now, when we talk about some of the more disadvantageous matchups, I'm not going to be pivoting off of Indianapolis Colts wide receivers or Chiefs wide receivers in the form of a Rashee Rice or a Michael Pittman Jr., because there is still so much more value to have going forward. And I truly do believe, considering they are the number 1 receivers within these offenses, I'm not incredibly scared about the potential of them finding success, but I am more rather kind of moving off of players like Brian Thomas Jr., who is not only dealing with an injury, but also has a difficult schedule ahead and is going to have to take on Sauce Gardner twice in the upcoming weeks here for the remainder of the season. So just kind of putting that into perspective. Now, let's go ahead and let's move on to the final spectrum of time here at the wide receiver conversation for the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17. Again, when you're preparing for the fantasy playoffs and putting yourself into a position to where you are already in a winning schedule and want to set yourself up for success, the reason why I'm not pivoting off of Michael Pittman Jr. is because he's going to help me capture a championship with the 4th easiest strength of schedule against Seattle, San Francisco, and Jacksonville. Then, of course, if we continue to repeat the sentiments of Jameson Williams, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Jordan Addison, like I mentioned earlier on in this episode, perhaps players like Jalen Waddle or Ricky Pearsall could be of incredible value going forward. Looking at the upcoming schedule for the Miami Dolphins at running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end, which you'll see in just a moment, everything is green across the board. So the potential of Jalen Waddle taking advantage of the opportunity on hand throughout these 3 games, especially week 15 against Pittsburgh, the easiest wide receiver matchup at the position, he would assumably light up that defense and find success. And the San Francisco 49ers being at the top of this conversation, maybe Pearsall and Ayuk, by the time we get to the fantasy playoffs, can be some difference makers. Now, of course, injured, but going forward could be some stashes as you proceed. Now, obviously the Cleveland Browns are at the top here. Outside of a potential quarterback switch to Sanders, I don't believe it's worth rostering any Cleveland Brown wide receiver as we go forward for the remainder of the year, unless Cedric Tillman comes out of nowhere and becomes a touchdown machine like we have seen before. Now, some of the more disadvantageous matchups throughout the fantasy playoffs consist of the Arizona Cardinals. I mean, just that alone. Marvin Harrison Jr. having to take on Derek Stingley, AJ Terrell, and then DJ Turner for 3 consecutive games. I'm not interested. Please and thank you. That is not something that I'm excited about, especially if Kyler's the return. I think it just lessens his overall potential for success. But again, those are the kind of things that we want to avoid. Number 1 coverage that is going to be disastrous. Now, in the case of someone like, Ladd McConkey as a slot receiving option going up against Kansas City, Dallas, Houston, I'm not worried about it because the majority of the great cornerback play there is on the outside. But I mean, Dallas is going to be a dominant performance nonetheless. So outside of, Kansas City and Houston, which really isn't accounting for that slot receiving coverage for a guy like Ladd McConkey, I'm not worried about this situation. So just putting that into perspective where I'm not trying to avoid these players outright if in fact we're in these upcoming matchups because they're not complete death sentences for them. Now, if we continue on to the tight end conversation, tight end's a little bit different. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter section because primarily everyone in your league probably has one good tight end. And unless you have a backup for your upcoming bye week, everyone is stable at the tight end position. But for those of you who are in a league in which you do not have a stable tight end and potentially trading for one is going to cost too much, I also want to suggest some potential pickups and options in which you can get on roster and put in your IR position for the remainder of the season, to which once they come back, they can certainly help you. We're talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars and Miami Dolphins, 2 of the top 4 matchups for the remainder of the fantasy football season. We're talking about Brenton Strange, who prior to him going down with his injury, was leading the organization in terms of receptions and receiving yards thus far this season. And then when we talk about Darren Waller, prior to him going down with his injury and going to the injured reserve, he was leading the tight end position in terms of fantasy points per game on average this season. So if both of those players come back healthy, ready to go, both can be huge difference makers and guys that are available in your league on probably the waivers to be stashed away in your IR position. But outside of that, when we're talking about studs at the top of this conversation with advantageous schedules ahead, Baltimore, Buffalo, San Francisco, the Los Angeles Chargers. Again, these are stud tight ends that have already played well. You could theoretically buy low on someone like George Kittle, who once Brock Purdy does return, he's going to put up touchdowns on a weekly basis. You could also look in the direction of maybe Isaiah Likely if something is to happen to Mark Andrews, could provide value there. But otherwise, Andrews, Kincaid, Kittle, Gadsden, all incredible players for the remainder of the season in terms of the upcoming schedule ahead. Now, if we want to go ahead and specifically focus on weeks 10 through 14, for those of you who need immediate help at the tight end position throughout this spectrum of time, again, we're still once again looking in the direction of technical studs that are on the Ravens, the Buffalo Bills, the Los Angeles Chargers, and the Kansas City Chiefs. So unless you're going to trade for one of those players, again, it's going to be incredibly difficult to navigate. But then again, we do have the Houston Texans and Dalton Schultz, who technically has an advantageous schedule ahead against Jacksonville, Tennessee, Buffalo, which I wouldn't want to play him against Buffalo, but Indianapolis, Kansas City. There's some matchups in there in which you could take advantage of him going throughout the spectrum of time with no bye week ahead. But even if your stud tight end, let's say, for example, Gadsden of the Los Angeles Chargers has an upcoming bye week ahead, I don't think in a win now situation you have to get rid of him, because I think it's a lot more appropriate, or at least a lot more accessible, to be able to replace your starting tight end with a potential weekly streaming option in comparison to running back, which many of us on roster don't have the equipped depth on our bench to be able to replace our studs in a week in which they are missing, considering how much fantasy points they contribute over the course of a given week. Now, looking at some of the more disadvantageous matchups we might want to get out from underneath Jake Ferguson in this overall situation. But then again, even in these difficult matchups, he will still find himself enough opportunity for success. Let's move on to the fantasy playoffs to the tight end position, which again, we are still in this conversation where studs like the Baltimore Ravens tight ends, San Francisco, Detroit, Arizona, and Indianapolis are all at the top of the conversation, which is incredible for those of us who have them on roster. But for those of you who are still looking for an affordable alternative, we're talking about the number one matchup at the position, the Miami Dolphins taking on Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Tampa Bay. Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, it wouldn't surprise me if Darren Waller came away with 2 touchdowns in each of those games. Genuinely. And then we have Mason Taylor, who has an upcoming schedule of Jacksonville, New Orleans, and New England. Then we have Brenton Strange, like I mentioned earlier, New York Jets, Denver, which I don't love the matchup against Denver, but then again, he gets Indianapolis the week after. And if he's going to be the primary threat within this offense, could be a player that we're just stashing on our rosters. And if in fact the opportunity presents itself to where he is a viable enough option by the time we get there, of course, could be a player that we're stashing on our teams and finding success within the fantasy playoffs. All right, let's go ahead and close out with, of course, some of the more disadvantageous matchups, giving a glance at that. And then we'll go ahead and let's talk about the quarterback conversation. Very similar to tight end. Many of us have a stud quarterback on roster. So if you have a Lamar Jackson or if you have a Jackson Dart, probably let's not look to pivot. But potentially you could look in the direction of guys like JJ McCarthy or Jared Goff, who may be available in your league. And if in fact that is the possibility, both of them have incredible strength of schedules in terms of fantasy passing statistics allowed thus far this season. In terms of upcoming games, I mean, again, 16 plus fantasy points per game allowed by those defenses that they're taking on for the final stretch of the season, weeks 10 through 17. So for those of you who are in a little bit of a bind at quarterback, maybe just lost Kyler Murray, or have been kind of flopping back and forth between guys like a Joe Flacco or a Caleb Williams, there's a possibility in which you could look in the direction of McCarthy and Goff to lead you to the promised land. Now, speaking of that promised land, of course, in order to get there, we have to navigate from weeks 10 through 14, in which throughout this spectrum of time, still at the top of the conversation, we have the Minnesota Vikings and, of course, the Detroit Lions. But alongside of them, we have the Arizona Cardinals, who Jacoby Brissett may in fact be our savior for those of you who just lost Kyler Murray, as his upcoming schedule ahead has Seattle, San Francisco, Jacksonville, Tampa Bay, and the Los Angeles Rams. Every single game out with a relatively tough running schedule ahead for their running backs, but subsequently that'll lead to even more passing statistics ahead for the quarterback position. So again, could look in that direction and also look at some of the more disadvantageous matchups where we might not feel so excited about the potential of guys like Baker or Brock Purdy or even someone like Dak Prescott, but we're hoping for shootouts throughout these spectrums of time to elevate their potential and of course any rushing statistics they're able to gather to add on top of their potential. Then we move on to the fantasy playoffs where we have Daniel Jones at the top of this conversation alongside of Jackson Dart. Tua Tagovailoa, not too interested in trusting him, but again, within this conversation, the Vikings, the Lions, and the San Francisco 49ers, all top 8 for the remainder of the season in terms of fantasy points per game allowed from the defenses that they will be taking on in terms of passing statistics. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to some potential names and trade targets you could be looking to go after based on rest of season strength of schedule from weeks 10 through 17. And hopefully today's episode was able to help you kind of designate which players that you should be targeting. But even if I mentioned go and trade for a Travis Etienne, it doesn't mean that the team in your league is going to be interested in trading for a player. You may be in a league in which, of course, players don't want to trade, or players don't understand the value of the prospects in which they have on their roster or how they can improve. But hopefully, navigating the overall statistics that I presented could lead you in the right direction and, of course, help you capture a 2025 Fantasy Football Championship. I, of course, wanted to go ahead and share some of the more disadvantageous matchups at quarterback for the Fantasy Football Playoffs. Of course, Mahomes at the bottom of that conversation, but ultimately taking on the Chargers in Denver. He's very familiar with those teams, so should still be very much so viable, especially considering he does accompany his performances with a lot of rushing statistics as of thus far this season. All right, let's close out today's episode by putting together a couple plays via Betr. Let's check that out right now. All right, so when we travel on over to Betr, there's 3 plays that I really love going into this week that I'm going to suggest, and it begins with the Sunday morning early matchup between the Indianapolis Colts taking on the Atlanta Falcons. I love the potential of Daniel Jones surpassing 243.5 passing yards, and I'm going to go more on that number, and I'll tell you exactly why. Over the course of this season, Daniel Jones is number 2 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of passing yards against the blitz. The Atlanta Falcons lead the National Football League in terms of blitz percentage amongst all teams. And when Daniel Jones has taken on teams thus far this season who have been in the top 7 of the blitz percentages, Pittsburgh, Miami, and Denver, he has totaled 342, 272, and 316 passing yards in those 3 individual games. Therefore, taking on the number 1 blitz team in the National Football League because of this incredible offensive line and pass blocking that they continue to put forth on a weekly basis, keeping Daniel Jones protected, it has put him in a position to where, of course, he can dice up secondaries in one-on-one man coverage, in which he is, of course, demonstrated. I understand that they're going to be playing in Germany this upcoming Sunday morning. He has already in his career traveled to Germany as early as last season against Carolina. He traveled to London in 2022 against Green Bay, so he is not inexperienced within the overseas travel. I expect him to surpass this number. You could very easily take him at 224.5. I think that's an incredible number. In fact, that number was 229.5 about an hour ago when I was originally putting this together. I think that's a fantastic play. I also like the potential of Daniel Jones going more than 1.5 passing touchdowns. Of course, he has scored many of touchdowns over the course of his career, but the Falcons, as of late, for the last 5 games, have allowed 2 or more passing touchdowns, while he has, of course, been able to accomplish this in 4 of his last 5 games as well. This most recent game against Pittsburgh was an absolute disaster, as the offense turned over the ball 6 times, 5 of which was Daniel Jones, which, of course, led to the overall underwhelming performance. I anticipate him to be able to go more than 243 passing yards, and additionally more than 1.5 passing touchdowns within the upcoming contest ahead. Then if we continue on, let's talk about the Buffalo Bills taking on the Miami Dolphins. While I could go ahead and put together a play with James Cook scoring a touchdown or Achane racking up receptions, as of course, Achane has had 7+ receptions in each of the last 3 games against his division rival, the Buffalo Bills, I want to talk about Dalton Kincaid, because the matchup on hand this week does provide a lot of value for going more than 3.5 potential receptions. I'll tell you why. The Dolphins over the course of the last 5 games have allowed 7, 9, 5, and 9 receptions to opposing tight ends. So over the course of the last 4 games, that's 7.5 receptions per week to opposing tight ends. And Dalton Kincaid earlier this season against the Miami Dolphins on a short week, Thursday night, week 3, had 5 catches on 6 targets, 66 yards, and a touchdown. And over the course of his entire career, he has had 5 consecutive games against the Miami Dolphins, all more than 4 receptions. So 3.5 receptions should be an absolute automatic. So if I go ahead and put that together with Daniel Jones here in this overall situation, I like the overall potential of his touchdowns. Genuinely, I think he'll be able to accomplish that. But if we're just looking at the total potential of yardage, I think that's very much so achievable. So either way, I'm very much so happy with it. And if we go ahead and pair them up with one more player, which is not only going to increase the overall multiplier of this play, but give me even that much more confidence in the potential, it's going to be Chris Olave, in the absence of Rashid Shaheed, having himself a nuclear performance of going more than 49.5 receiving yards. You may think, Andrew, is that a nuclear performance? No, it's not. But for the overall of a 3.5x multiplier, I think it is. Looking at the potential of Chris Olave and his success against zone coverage, he has the 9th highest target rate amongst all wide receivers against zone. He is tied for the 2nd most receptions against zone coverage thus far this season with Jackson Smith-Njigba, and only behind Jamar Chase. And on top of it, the Carolina Panthers are number 1 in the National Football League in terms of zone coverage ran 82.2% of the time this season. Rashid Shaheed's absence should increase target opportunity, as he has had 30 targets in the last 3 games, and going more than 49.5 receiving yards should very easily be accomplishable, as he has done it in 8 of his 9 games this season already. Therefore, these are the 3 plays that I'm going with this week. Again, there are many of other plays that we can go ahead and put together, but for those of you who want to go ahead and put together your own plays, use code Andrew today. Make that first time deposit minimum of 10. Make that first time play minimum of $1 within a real cash play, and get my ranking sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. But these are the 3 plays that I like. Of course, keep up with me tomorrow in our live stream, and of course, Sunday morning live streaming here on the channel starting at 6 a.m. PST to check out the other plays that I'm putting together for this week. But that's going to cover for me today. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.